Okay, so I'm going to do a quick video on the Apostle Paul. I'm going to read from the book of Acts, chapter 9, beginning with verse 1, all the way down to verse 16. Verse 1 says, "And Saul, this was his name before they began to call him Paul. And Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went unto the high priest." Here it says that Paul was threatening to kill the followers of Christ. And one of the reasons for that was because Paul was a Pharisee at the time, meaning he wasn't familiar with a lot of the teachings the disciples of Christ were spreading during the time that Christ walked the earth. Or I should say, after Christ ascended up to heaven. Paul was only familiar with the Mosaic law and a lot of the teachings from the Old Testament. So he thought that what these people were spreading was nothing more than heresy. Verse 2 says, "And desired of him letters to Damascus to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were man or woman, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem." Verse 2 basically says that Paul wanted authority from the high priest so that he can take these people up to Jerusalem, these people that were spreading the message of Christ, preaching Christ, whether they were man or woman, in order that he might convict them before the high priest. Verse 3, "And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven." Verse 4, "And he fell to the earth, and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?" Verse 5, "And he," Paul, said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, or Yeshua, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks." Verse 6, "And Paul, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And Christ said unto him, Arise and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do." So, here lets us know that Paul had a personal encounter with Christ. Verse 7, to continue reading. "And the man which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man." So there were actual witnesses with Paul when he experienced this supernatural encounter with Christ. The men that were with him heard him speak to someone. They heard the voices, but they couldn't tell who he was speaking with. Verse 8 says that Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man, but they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. So basically, Paul was blinded. I'm not sure if this was because when Christ appeared to him, he was so bright that it caused him to lose his eyesight, or was this intentionally done because Christ was going to work some kind of miracle in his life? Well, let's find out. Verse 9. "And he," Paul, "was 3 days without sight, and neither did eat nor drink." In other words, he was blind for 3 days. Verse 10, "And there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him said the Lord in a vision, Ananias. And Ananias said, Behold, I am here, Lord." Verse 11, "And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the street which is called Straight, and inquire in the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus, for behold, he prayeth." Verse 12, "He prayeth, and hath seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him, that he might receive his sight." In other words, the Lord is commanding this disciple called Ananias to go rendezvous with Paul and lay hands on him and give him supernatural healing in order to restore his sight back to him. And you get the impression that the reason Christ blinded Paul was in order to strengthen his faith, in order that he may believe upon him and the workings that a lot of the miracles that Christ did when he walked this earth. Because there were many unbelievers at the time, not just Paul. So Paul wasn't the only one skeptical in the teachings of Christ. So the Lord found it necessary to work this miracle in his life and convert him. Verse 13 says, Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard by many of this man how much evil he had done to thy saints at Jerusalem. Verse 14, And here he had authority from the chief priests to bind all that call on thy name. In other words, Ananias is letting the Lord know that he's heard of the reputation of Paul. He knows what kind of reputation this man has, how evil he treated the followers of Christ. If you read some of the early chapters of this book of Acts, you come to find out that Paul was responsible for the death of the apostle, or I should say disciple, follower of Christ, called Stephen. Paul was one of the people responsible for his death of this follower of Christ that was stoned to death. So Ananias was hesitant to go visit him and restore his sight back to him, just so that he could get persecuted by Paul. So he was skeptical that Paul would convert. And he's saying here that he knows that Paul had a lot of authority from the chief priests to lock up all that were spreading the message of Christ. Verse 15, to continue reading. But the Lord said unto him, Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. So Paul was the one that was in charge with the task to spread the message of Christ to not only the Gentiles and the kings of the earth, but the Israelites as well. Because at the time there were many Israelites who were only familiar with the message of the Old Testament and the Mosaic Law. So all this stuff that was being preached to them was new to them. So they were quite skeptical of it and they weren't sure of what to believe. There are some so-called believers that think themselves to be Israelites, and they like to say that all the Gentiles got to go through the teachings of Paul. No, not only do the Gentiles got to go through the teachings of Paul, but also the Israelites as well. As Christ said, I am the truth, the way, and the life. No one goes to the Father except through me. So Christ is that gate. And a lot of that message is contained within the epistles of Paul. That's why a lot of people like to attack the teachings of Paul in order to discredit them, because they know that message of salvation, a lot of that message is contained within the scriptures and epistles of Paul. So when they attack him, they do it purposely. Some do it ignorantly. They like to say that he never had an encounter with Christ. Well, chapter 9 of the book of Acts verifies that he very much did. And not only that, but there's a witness to that. Ananias. He was the one in charge of delivering that message to Paul, that he was to become an apostle and spread the message of Christ not only to the Gentiles again, but also the kings of the earth as well as the children of Israel. So you don't get a free pass just because you are a descendant from an Israelite. You got to believe in the message that Christ brought with him when he walked this earth. Matter of fact, not only that, but you got to believe everything that is written in your Bible. You can't call yourself a believer if you don't believe in what is written within the Bible. You can't pick and choose what you want to believe and what you don't want to believe. You got to believe what's written from Genesis all the way to Revelation. Verse 16, to complete the video. For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. So here Christ says that Paul was going to experience some suffering while he would spread the message of Christ. Just as the other disciples suffered at the hands of Paul for spreading Christ's message, so too would Paul suffer for spreading his newfound faith. Kind of ironic, but that's what it says. So there you have it. For all those Paul haters out there that like to discredit his teachings and accuse him of being a false apostle, apparently you guys know more than the people that wrote these scriptures, because you like to pick and choose what you want to believe and then lord it over other people and say that they should believe this and they shouldn't believe that. No. People are entitled to believe whatever they want to believe. And if you call yourself a believer in the Word and like to overlook the epistles of Paul, then hey, have at it. There's a place for people like that. It's called the lake of fire. So on that note, I will end this video and I'll see you guys in my next one. Peace.